Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down a documentary that really challenges the way we usually think about the history of slavery. We're going to walk through its main arguments and the data that it uses to present a very different perspective on this global institution.
You know, the documentary we're looking at kicks right off with a really bold claim that the story of slavery most of us learned in school is missing huge, critical pieces of the puzzle. And because of that, it leaves us with a pretty distorted view of the past. All right, so here's how we're going to break down the source's argument. First up, we'll look at where the ships in the transatlantic slave trade actually went. It's probably not where you think. Then, we'll turn to a powerful African kingdom that literally built its wealth on the trade. After that, we're going to explore the often overlooked history of enslaved Europeans. And we'll wrap it all up with the documentary's controversial take on who really brought slavery to an end. So the source's case starts by shifting our focus. It argues that we tend to see the transatlantic slave trade through a very American lens, when the reality is it was this massive global enterprise with destinations stretching way beyond North America. And here's the data the documentary uses to back that up. And wow, I mean, just look at these numbers. Out of roughly 12.5 million enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic, the numbers are absolutely staggering. You see that a combined total of nearly 10 million people were taken not to North America, but to Brazil and the sugar colonies of the Caribbean. So when you boil all that data down, you get this single, pretty jarring number from the documentary. It argues that the territory that would eventually become the United States, well, it received only about 3% of the total human cargo of the transatlantic slave trade. Just 3%. Okay, so after establishing this global scale of the trade, the documentary pivots to a really crucial question. Where did the slaves come from? And its focus shifts to the African continent itself, arguing for the absolutely central role that powerful African empires played in the whole system. The source material really zeroes in on this quote from a 19th century king in Dahomey, and the argument here is that for this incredibly powerful kingdom, slavery wasn't just, a business. It was, in the king's own words, the ruling principle. It was the very source of their glory, their wealth, and their identity. And to really underscore the kingdom's complete reliance on slavery, the documentary points to some truly brutal practices. It describes a society where, according to the source, palaces were decorated with human skulls, and constant warfare was just a hunt for more captives. And if they weren't sold, some were used in mass human sacrifices. And this is where we get to one of the documentary's most provocative points. It draws a direct line from European colonialism to the end of these specific practices, arguing it was the French conquest of Dahomey in the late 19th century that finally brought this particular slave-trading empire to its knees. Now, the documentary's narrative doesn't just stop in Africa. It actually broadens its scope to argue that the story of slavery isn't tied to any single race. And to do that, it turns its lens to what it calls the widespread and brutal enslavement of Europeans. And the scale of this, according to the source, was just immense. It puts the number at an estimated 1.5 million European Christians who were captured and enslaved by Barbary pirates from North Africa over a 300-year period. 1.5 million. And to bring this history to life, to make it feel real, the documentary pulls quotes describing specific attacks. Things like this one, depicting a terrifying raid on a village in Ireland, just to illustrate the constant threat that coastal European communities were living under. The documentary then draws a really sharp distinction in motivation. It presents the transatlantic trade as a brutal, yes, but fundamentally economic enterprise. The Barbary raids, on the other hand, are framed as something completely different, an ideological and religious war, described by the sources as a form of jihad. The argument about European enslavement also extends to the American colonies, where the source takes a hard look at indentured servitude. It claims that far from being some simple work contract, for many white laborers, it was basically slavery. It was brutal, it was often permanent, and in some documented cases, the contracts themselves actually use the word slave. So the point the documentary is really trying to drive home with this is that this kind of bondage was not some footnote in colonial history. It claims this was the system that built the colonies, asserting that somewhere between 60 and 70% of all white immigrants arrived in America either in chains or under a contract of servitude. So, after painting this picture of slavery as this universal human institution, something practiced by pretty much everyone, everywhere, the documentary finally arrives at its climax. The question shifts from who practiced slavery to the much more specific question of who ended it. This timeline is absolutely central to the source's final argument. Think about this. It highlights how, in the year 1800, slavery was legal everywhere on Earth. But by 1900, in what was a really rapid historical turn, the entire Western world had systematically outlawed it, and this frames abolition as a uniquely Western project.
Right here, the documentary presents what is really its core thesis. It argues that what made the West historically unique wasn't that it participated in slavery, but that it made the decision to end it. The source highlights the British Royal Navy's anti-slavery patrol as a prime example, a massive, incredibly expensive, decades-long military campaign to literally stamp out the slave trade on the high seas.
So to bring it all together, the documentary connects all these different threads. The global destinations, the African slaving empires, the enslaved Europeans, to build one central narrative, that for most of human history, slavery was just the norm. It was the default. Abolition, it argues, was the radical exception, and it was born out of a movement within Western civilization.
And so the documentary leaves the viewer with this final, really challenging question. If slavery was a universal human sin, is the most important part of the story who did it, or who was the first to put a stop to it? That's the perspective from this particular source, and that's The Explainer.